Greetings from Center. I'm Eric Mount. Some of you may remember me. I taught in the religion program for 36 years, and along the way also did stints as chaplain and director of the program in Strasbourg twice, with my French teaching wife Truly carrying me through. And I was tennis coach even for a period of time. And now I hang out at Jurassic Park, across the street here, where the retirees hang out. Today, I want us to talk about something that I dealt with in several columns that I wrote for our local newspaper, namely reparations, the idea of making amends or repaying a debt to people who were treated badly, shall we say. In this case, we're talking about reparations for slavery of African Americans and the aftermath of slavery, and we'll talk about some of those aftermaths. And when we start getting into the issue of reparations, we might cast our eyes back to the end of the Civil War, when General William Sherman proposed a form of reparations in terms of property restoration to 18,000 former slaves and family members in the area of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. He had before him 18,000 acres that he could distribute, and he felt that they were owed land to live on. And so he divvied it up, about 40 acres to a family. Well, it didn't take long for that to evaporate. In December of that very year, President Andrew Johnson rescinded what General Sherman had done. So reparation, that wasn't something that the Reconstruction wanted to see happen. And indeed, the Reconstruction was a time when things that the freed slaves thought were coming their way were either taken away or never granted. Another place to start talking about reparations is with Representative John Conyers, who represented Detroit in the U.S. Congress for many years. He retired in 2017 and died just in 2019. But way back in 1989, he proposed a bill that kept coming up every year for 30 years and receiving very little notice. And I have here the very wording of that bill, which will help us understand what we're talking about when we talk about reparations. He proposed forming a commission to study the impact of slavery, consider a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery, the nation's subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans, and the impact of these forces on living African Americans. I used those terms de jure and de facto and because they're in his proposal, and also because those terms will become relevant again when we talk about the history of I guess you'd say government-enforced, government-implemented residential segregation. And one of the books that I want to mention to you talks about the ways in which the government and its agencies actually legislated or failed to enforce legislation that would have prevented the segregation of the races residentially. So de jure means by law. Well, a lot of it was by law. De facto is what is in fact happening in place. All right, so here we're talking about Conyers, and we're talking about his proposal, which languished, even though he kept bringing it up. And finally, at the year of his retirement, there was some discussion of it. And in the most recent congressional scene, a bill very much like his was introduced both in the Senate and in the House. Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas was the one in the House, and in the Senate it was Cory Booker, who was a presidential candidate from New Jersey. So they brought it up. And the candidates for president began to talk about reparations and to be asked whether they supported it or not, and some did. So what had happened in the meantime? Several things had happened, and one I think that was, its importance maybe wasn't sufficiently noted at the time, but it was an article written in 2014 by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and his name will be on a list of sources that I want to spread before you, hoping that you'll read some of these things. Anyway, Coates wrote a 16-page article in The Atlantic entitled "The Case for Reparations." And he made a very powerful argument about the ways in which African Americans had been denied residential accommodation, property rights, been denied a number of things that should have been coming their way, and he documented it. Interestingly enough, a man named David Brooks, who writes for the New York Times, reported later that when he read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, he said, I had mild disagreement with it. 5 years later, he decided he had strong support of it, because as he had gone around the country and talked to people about what's dividing America and what needs to be healed in order for us to move ahead as a united people, he became convinced that until we do reparations, we're not going to be able to move ahead as a united country. So he wrote a column in the Times which supported the idea of reparations. So it's come back into the forefront of discussion. And interestingly enough, there has been a slight move forward, if you will call it a move forward, which I do, in terms of people's support of the idea. But before we talk about slight movement forward, let's look at these statistics that I've put up here on the whiteboard. These tell you roughly, the last of these statistics dated in October of 2016. But here we see 29% of Americans favor reparations. It's not so good. But if you can believe it, it's up from what it was in 2002. And I'll give you some of those statistics. 15% of white Americans favor it. 74% of African Americans favor it. And 64% of Hispanic Americans. Then I've got something about the idea of apology. You remember that was one of the things that John Conyers mentioned in his proposal about studying reparations with the idea possibly of an apology by our nation for slavery. 64% of white Americans oppose making an apology. 77% of African Americans favor the making of apology. 64% of Hispanic Americans favor making an apology. Now below this I have written, just because I guess it interested me somewhat, but we need to dwell on it, how the support or opposition breaks down by age group. So here you have the baby boomers, 51 to 69, 79% opposed. Generation X, 35 to 50, 73% opposed. It's only when you get to the millennials, 23 to 34 years old, some would raise that to higher in the 30s, 51% in favor or not sure. So you see there's a generational issue here about who is lukewarm or even opposed. And of the millennials, 44.2% of those in support were minorities. So you have a greater minority representation. And then below this, I have the party breakdown, for and against. Republicans, 5% for, 92% against. Independents, 32% in favor, 65% against. And then the Democrats, 49% for and 47% against. Now I want to pick up on a couple other statistics that relate closely to this, and that is what changes have occurred between 2002 and 2019. The American people as a whole had moved from 14% in favor to 29% in favor. So you can see, it took a while, but you can see a movement going on. And against, you moved from 81% against to 67% against. So, there's a kind of a gradual drift going on here. And then we look at the breakdown, the transition, if you will, on the party scene. The Republicans had gone up to 5% in favor from 4%. Well, it's a little bit. The Independents had gone up to 32%. Well, no, they got to 32%, having earlier, well, I can't find it. But the Democrats at 49% were up from 25%. And maybe in a minute I'll come up with the independents, but I don't know that we need that. So that's the statistical picture. It tells you about the reticence of people to talk about reparations, or especially to talk about an apology. And this gets us into the whole issue of the reticence of talking to talk about racism, because people don't like to think they're racist. And if you ask them to apologize for something they don't think they had anything to do with, or if you ask them to pay for something that they think is in the past, a debt to be discharged, then you're into the issue of, is there just racism when there's bigotry present, or personal prejudice present, or is there also something called systemic racism, or institutional racism, or structural racism that has a life of its own, that perpetuates itself in our practices and in our institutions without being the intent of people who get up in the morning thinking, how can I discriminate against people of color? So we're looking at a delicate topic, if you will. We don't like to talk about racism, and one of the columns that I wrote deals with that. And one of the privileges of this lecture is that you're going to be given a list of columns that deal with several of the issues that we're talking about. And those will be made available to you as attachments on your computer. So if you really get eager to think further about this, you'll have a chance to look at that. All right, so I want to read a couple of quotations now from two of the people that I've already mentioned, Ta-Nehisi Coates and David Brooks. And I want to point out some similarities in the language that they use. These are some words from Ta-Nehisi Coates. He says, "We need a national reckoning that would lead to a spiritual renewal. We might locate a debt," I want to underline that word debt, because it's going to be used by Brooks and it is used by Coates. We might locate a debt so large it can't be imagined, let alone calculated and dispensed. In other words, it's bigger than most any of us imagine. How could it ever be repaid? And then Brooks says, slavery is a sin that assaults the moral order. He says it is the original sin that hardens the heart, separates Americans from one another, and serves as the model and fuel for other injustices. A collective debt, he said, that will have to be paid. So he comes to the conclusion that if we are going to move ahead as a united country, the single most important thing that needs to be addressed is slavery and its aftermath and its implications. Because as he went around the country and as he talked to people, as he reflected further on Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, he went from mild disagreement to strong support. And he talked about a gigantic wealth divide. And before we're through, we're going to talk about the issue of the gulf in wealth between African Americans and white people in this country. But before we get into that, I want us to think about some of the past conditions, actions, deprivations that feed into these claims by Ta-Nehisi Coates and David Brooks and others, that there's a lot to make up for. There's a debt, a huge debt. And of course the people who are reticent about talking about this say, but I didn't create that debt. And the people, the African Americans living today, were not slaves. And so there's this argument that says, haven't we put that behind us? Our own Senator McConnell had this to say. He said, he rejected any move toward reparations. He believes we've been there and done that. He says, we've tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation, and we've elected an African American president. So in effect, he says, what more do we have to do? Well, it depends on how you read our history and how you delve into what African Americans have had to deal with. So I've got listed over here some things that various writers, including the ones that I've mentioned, flag as examples of what has gone on, if you will. At the top of the list, I say much white wealth was built on slave labor. Reading one time in the Smithsonian magazine, I learned that Thomas Jefferson, having been an opponent of slavery, at some point realized that our economy could make it without slavery. And so he backpedals. He becomes a less ardent opponent of slavery because we are so economically dependent on it. Denial of property reparations in the Reconstruction. Well, we had an example, didn't we? I started out with General Sherman, and he didn't get very far with his proposal for 40 acres for those 18,000 former slaves and their families. President Andrew Johnson took care of that. Then there was something during the Reconstruction called convict leasing. So here you have imprisoned African Americans, and so they could be leased to plantation or business owners and labor, and of course not for pay. And so the people that describe this history say it was slavery by another name. And one of the things they mentioned is the vagrancy laws. A person could be put in prison for very little. Vagrancy could mean simply that you didn't have a place to live and you were in the public scene without any moorings, maybe. But there was also the problem of if an African American did not use the proper terms of respect in talking to a white person, you could be in prison. And you could very easily run up a debt if you had very little wherewithal to buy things. You could easily get in debt, and you could end up in prison. Call that debt peonage. And then there were the lynchings. The Tuskegee Institute records 3,446 African Americans lynched between 1882 and 1968. So people were intimidated not to make waves, not to demand rights, because if they were uppity and demanding, look what could happen, and people could be lynched for practically nothing. Housing discrimination, which we will talk further about. Then I moved to some things in the New Deal, Social Security and the GI Bill. These were great progressive steps under the Roosevelt administration, but African Americans didn't always profit from these. The GI Bill made possible housing, education, and jobs. You heard people say, when I got out of the war, I got to go to college on the GI Bill. Well, the only problem was black vets in the South didn't get to go to college on the GI Bill. They didn't get to get a home mortgage on the GI Bill because they were African Americans. And then there's Social Security. Social Security, that's been such a blessing to so many people, did not cover farm labor and domestic workers. And what were most of the African Americans that we're talking about? A whole lot of them were farm workers and domestic workers. And so here's another place where great steps forward for some people meant kind of running in place for African Americans. Residential segregation. Here I might as well, I'm going to finish my list and then I'm going to come back to this book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. All right, there's redlining, which means that there are certain areas of the town where the banks will not give you a loan to have a mortgage, to build a house, to buy a house. You redline, and some people call it prudent underwriting to redline certain parts of town. Others just call it institutional racism because it ends up dislocating and dealing shabbily with African Americans. Denial of loans, predatory lending, prohibition of accumulation in the welfare program. I mention this because if you are on aid to families with dependent children, or you're on food stamps, and you have any accumulated wealth, you're off. Because if you have something in reserve, you don't need help, you're off. Well, this is a huge discouragement to people to try and save, to try and make it, and goodness knows if you live on a welfare budget, you don't have a lot of decision making to do about whether you can save. Then comes mass incarceration. The key book in that case is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. And what it does is document, particularly in connection with the war on drugs, the ways in which the prosecution, the policing, the imprisonment, the whole business that went into the huge percentage of imprisoned persons that are African American males. If you look at that, the drugs that where people look for drug users and drug dealers, what drugs they were targeting, what sentences were handed down. Was it white-collar crime or was it street crime? Anyway, Michelle Alexander does a fantastic job of laying out mass incarceration as but the latest chapter in this history that we're talking about. Targeting by law enforcement and the court system, real estate steering people toward certain parts of town and away from certain parts of town, and then lower educational and employment opportunity. I want to read a few lines that are really a kind of a summary from this book. This is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, and it's on the list. You're going to get this list. You're not only going to have a list of my newspaper columns, which you can get hold of if the topic appeals to you, or even if it doesn't appeal to you. Do me a favor, just read a few of these. And you'll get the argument of several of these books in 2 pages if you read my column. But my real recommendation is read the whole book. And here is one of the books, Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law. The subtitle is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. So what he's saying is, look, it's not just a matter of the prejudice of individual whites. The actual agency regulations, the actual laws, created residential segregation in this country. And I'm just going to read, it's about a paragraph and a third here. And these are my attempt to put into words what takes Rothstein quite a length of time, because he's got more footnotes than you can imagine. So here we go. Public housing during World War II was unavailable to African American workers who had to commute further to defense jobs that received lower pay than comparable jobs of whites. After the war, white people were often able to move up into the middle class, while African Americans continued to deal with blatant discrimination under Jim Crow laws. Whites were welcomed into suburbs that reacted violently to African Americans who attempted to integrate their neighborhood. The real estate industry and the banking industry collaborated to steer the races away from each other. The litany of woes is long. The federal government urged suburbs to adopt exclusionary zoning laws, thereby encouraging white flight. The Federal Housing Association sponsored whites-only suburbanization. State courts blessed private discrimination by ordering eviction of African Americans barred by local association rules and restrictive covenants. Churches, schools, and hospitals did not lose tax-exempt status for promoting restrictive covenants. That is, covenants that said certain people can't live here or hang out here. Police sometimes even encouraged mob violence against desegregation attempts rather than make arrests. State real estate commissions did not deny licenses to brokers who claimed an ethical obligation to impose segregation. Federal and state highway planners used urban interstates to demolish neighborhoods and force residents deeper into ghettos. Working class black families were trapped in lower income minority communities. The federal government spent billions on tax breaks for single-family suburban homeowners and failed to fund transportation networks adequately. Toxic waste facilities were consistently located in predominantly African American neighborhoods. In every instance, different actions by federal, state, and local government could have produced different outcomes. And he goes on to talk about some Supreme Court decisions that further added to the problem. So what we've done is, in a very cursory and hasty manner, we've talked about a history that has built up a debt. And so the question is, what could possibly be done to make up for that history? And we go back to the argument that we mentioned earlier of people that say, Well, who are you going to give the money to? Are you going to give it to LeBron and Oprah? Who are the people that are the most affected by slavery and its aftermath? How much would you give? Saying that we can't start giving money to people because of past injustices forgets that we've actually done it in at least one instance. Ronald Reagan was the president, and there was inaugurated something called the Civil Liberties Act. This is in 1988, and it dealt with Japanese Americans who during World War II had been interned in camps. And after the war, our country apologized. And our country, according to this act, which President Reagan signed, they gave $20,000 apiece to every one of these Japanese Americans that had been put in those camps. I think the initial assumption was it was going to be about 100,000 people, but it actually turned out to be 82,219 who received $20,000 apiece to try and make up somewhat for they had been subjected to during World War II. So there was a case where the government did say, we apologize and we're going to do something about it. But the debate rages now about, well, what could be done if we're not sure who all the people should be that got a cash settlement? What are some of the moves we could make? One proposal is that we guarantee post-secondary education to everybody. And some of our presidential candidates in this go-round are talking about that. Tuition for everybody to a state college or university. And that, of course, wouldn't just go to African Americans. But if you believe that the history of African Americans in this country has been one of educational disadvantage, fewer going to college, fewer able to afford it, etc., then that would be a move that would definitely do some reparations for a lot of people, because it would help them get things that their lack of generational wealth often kept them from getting. So that's one example. I want to talk about a different example now, and that's going to get us into our central column here. So we come to a case that's being made about one of the gaps that's most apparent between white Americans and black Americans, and that's the wealth gap. And I'm going to be indebted, somewhat indebted to David Brooks, who's talked about the gigantic wealth gap. But the single figure that has informed me the most on this issue is a man named William Darity, D-A-R-I-T-Y. He teaches at Duke University, and he and several of his associates got out a study that asked the question, let me give you the title, What We Get Wrong About Closing the Racial Wealth Gap. That was the name of their study. And that came out several years ago, and I gained most of these statistics from that. But even as we speak, a new book by Darity and one of his colleagues, Kirsten Mullen, I think it's out maybe this week. It's due for publication as we speak. And the name of it is From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. It's going to be published, or is being published, by the University of North Carolina Press. All right. So here's what Darity and these other folks have to say. They say if you look at income disparity, you can find there is an income disparity between African Americans and white Americans. But African Americans, on average, make 50 to 60% of the median white family income. Well, we'd hope that could be gotten up to 100%. But 50 to 60% is way different from 5 to 10% of the wealth of white families. Here's more. African Americans make up 13% of our population, 3% of the wealth. And one study said 9% of white wealth. See, this one said 5 to 10. Well, there's one that actually added it all up, and it was 9%. 5.4% of the net worth of the average white family for every $100 of white net worth. $5.04. Darity cites a specific location, namely Boston. And he said the average family wealth of a white family in Boston, I'm not going to give you the exact sense, but $240,000 and change, let's say. Guess what it is for African Americans? $8. So when we look at this issue of wealth gap, we're talking about something that kind of puts income gap, and the income gap's important, but the wealth gap is much bigger and much more devastating in certain ways, because if you want to go to college, generational wealth makes a difference. If your parents and your grandparents don't have a thing to give you, then your chances of going are not as good as they are for somebody that has generational wealth. If you want to buy a house, if you want to start a business, if you want to make it through a terrible health crisis that saps all of your money, and there's nothing in the pipeline, there's no generational accumulation of wealth, then you're in a different ballgame. And that's what Darity is trying to get us to see. So here we go down. This was about African Americans, remember? This is about white households. They have 20 times the wealth of African American households. 10% of white households have 0 to negative wealth. You know, there's such a thing as negative wealth too. How far in debt are you? 25% of African American households are in that deal. In another study, 15% of whites and over 1/3 of black households fall into that 0 to negative. 94% of white households have a share above the average of African American households. The average differential between households, white, black, African American, $800,000. And in 1983 to 2013, white wealth went up 14%. Black wealth down 75%. Hispanic wealth down 50%. So, says Darity, William, I think his nickname is Sandy. I don't know how he got that name, but anyway, Sandy Darity, Professor Darity, public policy professor, economist. He said when you look at employment, wealth, and family income and relative economic position, in those respects, the condition of African Americans is virtually unchanged since the Civil War. So when you start saying that, well, we're trying to rectify something that goes back to the Civil War, and the Civil War is over, and look how much time has elapsed, and then when Darity can document that when you look at employment, wealth, family income, and relative economic position, the relative standing is virtually unchanged since the Civil War. Now, Darity and his colleagues have a couple of proposals, and they know it's going to be expensive. How are we going to come up with the money? Trillions of dollars would be required to really close the wealth gap. But they have two specific recommendations that I throw out for your consideration. One is guaranteed jobs. The unemployment of African Americans has tended to run twice that of white Americans. And so Darity and company say, what if we guaranteed to every person a job, not only a job, a good job that had fringe benefits, health care? What if we guaranteed that? Well, obviously, to guarantee it, the government would have to, what private employers didn't do, the government would do. And it would cost money. But the claim of Darity is that if everyone had a good job that didn't pay minimum wage, a good job, and had retirement and health care, it would be a huge gap closer. Then they've got another one, has a kind of a catchy name, baby bonds. How many of us came into this world already with some wealth on our side? I did. I didn't come from rich parents or rich grandparents, but I guarantee you, I never lacked for anything when it came to my education, my future opportunities and possibilities, because my forebears held jobs, saved money, bought homes, and so on. So anyway, here's the way the baby bonds deal goes. When you get to be 18 years old, you get a grant. And this grant could run from $500. I guess this is the kind of, Bill Gates, I guess, when he was born, maybe he would have got $500, because I think he came from money and he's got tons of it. And these baby bonds could run up to $50,000. So if you're far enough down on the economic pecking order, you might have a legacy at age 18 of $50,000. And that might make it possible, you see, for you to draw on what would have been generational, passed on from your grandparents and your parents and your other relatives. And this would enable more home ownership. In Louisville, a year or so ago, the Metro Housing Commission estimated that to close the homeowner gap, that's a big gap, the homeowner gap in Louisville, 22,000 African Americans would need to be enabled to be homeowners. And narrowing the homeowner gap would narrow the wealth gap by 31%. So, I've thrown all of it at you. And what Conyers asked us to do, he didn't hand out a solution. Darity is trying to suggest some solutions. They're worth considering. But if you really believe the debt is as big as these shorthand references make it, if you really believe we have that kind of debt, and if you really believe that racism is the biggest separator we have going in this country, not bigotry, but the residue of slavery embodied in institutional, structural, systemic racism. If you really believe the debt is that big, and that it's the biggest barrier to our unity as a people moving into the future, then don't we owe it to study it, to learn the history that we would like to deny, and to move to the place where we're doing something to pay the debt. I hope that you will take my challenge to make this not just a mini lecture, but a mini course. And that would mean that you would get some of these columns that I wrote. If you do read any of them, it might make 3 people that have read them. I know my wife read them, and Milton Scarborough read them, some of my friends read them. I'm not sure anyone else has read them. But I'd love to be able to claim that 6 center alums read some of these columns. So anyway, these are going to be made available to you. But even better than that, what if you would actually get hold of The Color of Law, or Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Read these books. It will introduce you to a story that we need to have in common instead of having separate stories that continue to separate us. I appreciate the chance to have this class with you, and I urge you to take the whole course, because if you continue, you won't just have to deal with me. You can read some of these. Sandy Darity, William Darity, read From Here to Equality and be informed. Goodbye.